The real estate industry is a high-risk business, as we discover in our series In Good Company at 7:30 on Thursday. Now on ITV1, we're off to Canonbury Square.
The London Borough of Islington may be only 40 years old, but the history of Islington is one of the oldest in London, stretching as far back as the Domesday Book in the 11th century. What started life as an overnight stop for livestock on their way to Smithfield Market, where wild bulls roamed, is now one of the most desirable places to live in London. Run-down establishments have given way to smart restaurants, galleries and shops, whilst new shopping centres have grown up at the Angel and Nag's Head. However, it hasn't always been so. For much of the last century, Islington was a poor, down-at-heel area. The arrival of the railways and industrial development heralded social decline. Many big houses fell into disrepair, and Islington descended into slum conditions. It wasn't until the 1950s that wealthy householders such as Virginia Woolf's sister and other bright young things began buying and restoring the derelict properties. Michael Marland moved into Islington from Kent.
At the end of the 50s, my first wife desperately wanted to come back to London. So we went for an ad in St Paul's Road. When I got there, having driven up on my Vespa scooter, I was very upset to find it had gone. A man walking along said, "Go and see Mr Reeves at 23 Compton Terrace. He's the Marquess of Northampton's estate manager." I went to see Mr Reeves, and he said, "The flat next door is empty. Come and look at it." So I looked at it. I did the young husband act, knocking on the plaster, worrying about the woodwork. He said, "Don't take it if you don't like it. Round here, we lets only to artists, medics, and the like." I'll never forget. I didn't know whether he thought I was an artist, a medic, or the like. Nobody wanted to live here.
I remember reading that George Orwell, who'd recently moved into Canonbury Square, clearly preferred the tram lines of Canonbury to the salons of Chelsea, which shows how people regarded Canonbury then. When we were setting up our practice, we were little more than architectural students in the 1950s. The conversion of some of the houses in Canonbury Square was one of our jobs. We moved here because it was the cheapest place we could find. I mean, it was near central London where we wanted to be. It was much cheaper than suburbia, which is where most of us were living at the time. And we moved here because it was run down, slummy, war-damaged, etc.
Well, I've been here in Islington for more for 40 years. I came here because it had the kind of houses that I wanted to live in. I wanted the kind of pretty little house that you could get in Camden Hill, which was then an astronomic 6,000 and something pounds, whereas at Islington, where the property was very much run down, and you could get houses for 2,500. Mind you, they needed a lot of work. And of course you found that other people were trickling in. You very rapidly got to know your neighbours, which is pretty unusual in London.
In the 60s, the word terrace was a bad word. My mother had come from the Manchester slums. There's no way she ever wanted to live in a terrace again. But I rang my father up and said, "Dad, I've got a flat in Islington." "Islington," he said. "Michael, even the Lion's Corner house has closed. Nobody wants to live in Islington." But we did.
Now it is common for central Islington houses to fetch their £1 million asking prices. But in 1967, nearly 60% of Islington's housing stock was classified as multi-occupation. Most houses had outside lavatories and no baths. Angela Turner remembers the condition well.
I think my first memory of as a child in Canonbury Square was probably actually walking through the gardens with my mother when I was about 2. I remember the reflections of the plane trees. The plane trees have been here obviously for centuries now, and the lamplight will cast up beautiful shadows and reflections of the leaves and the beautiful circular seed pods that they have onto the ceiling. And I remember I used to stare up at those and thought how beautiful they were.
Angela was born in Canonbury Square, now one of the area's most prestigious addresses.
Well, my great-grandparents moved in the early 1920s to Canonbury House, I think it was originally called, which is now used as the Esterick Collection. My great-grandparents had an artificial flower-making factory there, which I was shown round one time and given a lovely flower arrangement to take back with me. So they lived there until my great-grandmother died. And then my father's parents lived in 32A and 31 Canonbury Square. And my mother's parents lived at number 5 Canonbury Square. And I think they moved there in the late 1930s. I was born at number 5. I think it was still fairly unusual even in those days to be born at home, but that's the way my mother wanted it, and so I was born in the first floor front room on 15th of July 1947. My grandparents lived in the middle of the house, so they had 4 or 5 lovely large well-proportioned rooms, and then downstairs in the basement lived Mrs. Wotton. I remember that she kept her ground floor accommodation, which must have been her best parlour, locked up, and she lived herself in one main room downstairs, and she had an outside lavatory in the garden. That was her lavatory. The other lavatory that we used was just past the stairs that led into the basement. And so I'd have to go downstairs sometimes in the dark and reach up to switch the light on in the main hallway. But the next light wasn't until I got round the corner into the lavatory. But this was past the entrance where Mrs. Wotton was, and I remember feeling a little bit scared